Good morning, lovelies, and welcome to Double Rainbows, the fascinating connection between autism and gender identity. This presentation is accredited for continuing education credits, specifically AMA, APA, AAPA, and AANC. It will also be recorded. Feel free to submit questions to the Q&A section whenever it enters your brain, and I'll answer them at the end. I am diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, so if there is a question that is triggering, I'll pass and answer it via Whova later. One more administrative note before I begin. I want to provide a trigger warning. There will be mentions of suicide and discussion of mortality rates in this talk. I wrote this entire talk for me to read aloud, so the written version can be made available if you'd rather read it quietly to yourself instead of listening to me speaking. Personally, I find reading softens the blow regarding sensitive content. With that said, you won't hurt my feelings if you need to drop off for any reason. Thank you for taking care of yourself. My name is Tessa Watkins, and my pronouns are they, them. Hi. In my professional life, I work as a full-time programmer for a digital advertising agency called Flying Cork. Flying Cork is a service provider with UPMC's digital marketing team, where I'm their WordPress expert. I also run my own side hustle called Arise Creative, where I offer affordable web development services for nonprofits, new and small businesses, startups, and individuals that want a website but don't know how to make one. In my personal life, I live with my partner who's an immigrant from England, our autistic daughter who is turning 5 next month, and our 2 cats, Toast and Topaz, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA. I remember learning that pets often resemble their owners in interesting ways. Toast is actually intersex because they had both sterilizing options performed when we adopted them. Z is also disabled with gut health issues and doesn't clean himself, so they get shaved every 6 months. Topaz is my old lady with anxiety and a hot temper when provoked. In my free time, I do my best to change the world for the better because I have a debilitating fear that my life will mean nothing. I am the vice president for Lebo Pride, a local queer and gender diverse nonprofit grassroots organization in Mount Lebanon. I'm an outspoken advocate on topics including neurodiversity, disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, anti-racism, and parenting, where I maintain a website, email newsletter, and social media presence as just one voice. Because I've yet to learn how to value my own time, I'm also an advocate for the Hidden Disability Sunflower. I'm on the planning committee for Dan Miller's annual Disability and Mental Health Summit and contributed to helping organize this conference. I really just attended meetings and screwed up their spreadsheets, so we'll say it's the thought that counts. Now that you know a little about me, probably too much, I want to know a little about you. Specifically, what's your relationship to this topic? Are you a member of either the autistic or gender diverse community? If not, how are you related? If you've been questioning whether or not you are, go ahead and check the box to say you are. You can check as many as you'd like. If you're using a desktop browser, you can open a new tab to submit your answers by going to menti.com and using that code 85834267. And it should start showing up here automatically. If you're on a mobile device, I'm like 70% sure that you'll still be able to hear me in the background as you minimize me to participate. Please do it. It's gonna be awkward. Okay. All right. I'm too anxious to wait. All right. Today, I'm here to talk to you about the double rainbow as it pertains to identity, to provide some language in describing a particular intersection of the human experience, and stories from my life as someone who exists at this intersection. Whatever reason you're here for, thank you for being here. Now, I'm a millennial, and I have echolalia, which can be triggered by anything, but when I read from a script, it's easier for me to mask things like this. However, I don't always want to mask, so I'm going to share this with you. I cannot think the phrase double rainbow without hearing this song. And it's not the whole song, it's just a version I edited to be a minute.
Whoa, that's a full rainbow all the way. Double rainbow, oh my god, double rainbow. It's a double rainbow all the way. Damn, it's a double rainbow all the way. Damn, oh my god. What does this mean? It's so bright, so vivid. Double rainbow, it's so intense, intense. What does this mean? It's starting to look like a triple rainbow. That's a whole rainbow, man. Ah! Double rainbow all the way across the sky. So intense. Double rainbow all the way across the sky. Wow, wow. Oh my god. Look at that rainbow. Woo! Woo! That is the baddest fucking rainbow I've ever seen.
Gone but not forgotten, Bear. May you rest in peace. Thank you for going on that tangent with me. So the intersection I'm focusing on is where neurotype meets gender. For neurotype, I'm focusing on autism versus allism. Autism stemmed from the Greek word autos, which means self, like automatic is self-starting, autonomous is self-doing, autopilot is a robot pilot you trust to fly planes. Allism stems from the Greek word allos, which means other, like allowance is money that comes from someone else. An allegory is a story with an alternate meaning. An ally is someone who supports someone else. These terms were used to describe our neurology and how we seem to engage with society. Humans are supposed to be pack animals, so when you've got one that is less than about others and more about self, it was pathologized. For gender, I'm referring to transgender and cisgender. The prefixes trans and cis mean across and same, respectively. For example, we'll say transatlantic when we're talking about a journey that crosses the Atlantic Ocean. With that in mind, when I say transgender people, I'm using the definition that means your gender is not what was recorded on your original birth certificate. So this includes identities that are agender, non-binary, and otherwise gender divergent and or non-conforming. The queer and gender diverse community is represented by the rainbow flag. The one I have here is the intersex inclusive Progress Pride flag, while the autistic community is represented by this other flag that features the neurodiversity symbol, a rainbow infinity, on a field of yellow, or gold, actually. Because this rainbow is used in representation for both communities, someone who belongs to both communities are double rainbows. I am one of such people. I am autistic. I self-identified first and then received a clinical diagnosis in 2020 when I was 29 years old. I'm also pansexual, which I've known that for a very long time, over 20 years. And I'm also gender fluid of the non-binary variety, and I embrace the trans label. I know that was a mouthful, and I don't usually describe myself like that when I meet people, as it depends on how safe I am with the people around me, how much they already know about these terms, and how much I feel like explaining. Fortunately for you, this is a safe space for me. I believe you all are familiar with most of what I just said, and I'm literally here to talk your ears off about it. So let's work it backwards. I embrace the trans label, meaning I'm just cool with being called trans. Not everyone like me embraces that label, and that's okay. I just wanted to clarify that I do. It's like saying you don't enjoy being called a Homo sapien. That's fine. I won't use that word to describe you, but it doesn't make it any less factually true. We can respect science and facts as well as people in their feelings. Both are possible. Depending on who I'm talking to, I might just tell people I'm trans and leave it at that. The term non-binary, as most of us probably know, means outside the binary male-female identities. When most cisgender people learn about transgender people for the first time, they always assume a total gender swap, which is how the terms male to female, or MTF, or female to male, FTM, came about, not to be confused with first-time mom. Both of those are already outdated and being replaced with a male at birth, AMAB or AMAB, and a female at birth, AFAB or AFAB. But in most cases, it's not relevant. It's interesting how people cling to gendered terminology when you're non-binary. You can be both a boy and a girl, neither a boy nor a girl, and both neither and both simultaneously. Basically, gender isn't a spectrum at all, but a spectra, and that's the plural word for spectrum. In my very own attempt at illustrating this, I created a pretty little triangle. In this corner, we've got the concept of masculinity. In this corner, femininity. In this corner, androgyny, or neither. Now, the traditional transgender journeys from male to female or female to male happen along this top line. I say traditionally because when you announce that you're trans, people usually assume you're jumping from one end to the other. That's the binary spectrum at work. But what if you're both? What if you love having your hair and makeup done, nails painted, but also sport facial hair? Then you'd still be along that spectrum, but somewhere in between masc and femme because you've got characteristics of both. Now, I know many people, when they first learn about non-binary, they incorrectly equate it with androgyny. We don't have to lack characteristics of men and women to be non-binary. But if that is you, you'd live at the third corner, far away from the traditional spectrum. Now, the two lines that connect to andro from masc and femme feels like what we would call in color theory saturation. Are you minimally feminine or maximum feminine? Meaning, do you like dressing up in dresses, heels, and doing all the girly stuff, or are you a tomboy? You can be a girl and still have masculine traits. Tomboys just fall somewhere in the middle, but closest to femme than the other 2 points. Me? Well, I'm all over the place. When I say gender fluid of the non-binary variety, it means my gender falls outside of that traditional binary spectrum. It's possible to be gender fluid within the binary, say perhaps you only exist along the traditional spectrum and no other space. Feel free to add what corners you might be in the comments because I am genuinely curious. However, I am the first to admit that my triangle representation isn't complete because it merges the concepts of gender identity and gender expression, and those are two very separate things. If you've never heard the acronym SOGI before, it stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Your orientation is how you feel about others, identity is how you feel about yourself, and expression is how you present yourself to others. So while my triangle is cool and might make sense for some, it's still incomplete. The infinite gender cube is another attempt at explaining gender that I thought was really cool, and I'd like to share that with you.
So gender is a spectrum, right? Wrong. One line is not enough. Chaka, chaka. We'll label this side the concept of boy, concept of girl on this side. So up here we have femininity, and down here we have masculinity. X-axis equals concept. Y-axis equals expression. And that's all you need to know, right? Wrong. There's gotta be a third axis. I'm calling this bad boy gender saturation, as in how much the idea of these labels matter to you. We'll label this side H for heck yeah it matters, and this side I for I don't give a fuck. Example of hypothetical gender. We have the butch lesbian. Before we dive in, these are arbitrary numbers. Concept of gender, 100, girl. Expression of gender, -100, masculine. Saturation of gender, 50. Yeah, definitely care about it quite a lot. Heck yeah. New gender just dropped. Here we have the elusive femboy. Concept, -100, boy. Expression, 100, feminine. Saturation at 50 for heck yeah. What's this doodad right here? This is the point of androgyny. To be at this point, it's more about the vibes than the looks. Well, would you look at that? It's the agender dot. Gender concept, 0 for no. Gender expression, whatever. Gender saturation, -infinity, my friends. Whoa, where did this blob come from? It's me. Hello. I have a lot of fluidity and variance in my gender, but I typically exist in this concept of girl and feminine expression region. Most of the time, I have a high saturation. It matters to me. Every now and then, I'm like, no, I don't get. Once again, the infinite gender cube. Give me your coordinates.
While I love this explanation, it too isn't complete because it doesn't cover all the ways you can be non-binary. The x-axis for concept only has a range for boy and girl, with androgynous being the center. It lacks a concept for people who are both. However, I love that it separates your feelings about gender from your expression of gender. I, for one, love how I look with makeup on, but because of my executive dysfunction related to being autistic, I can't always express the high intensity I have for my current gender. And I say current gender because this last part is going to be a doozy. The thing that is missing from both depictions is my full experience of being gender fluid. It's not just 2D, like my triangle, and it's not just 3D, like the cube. My gender identity is 4D. And no, I'm not talking about breaking the fourth wall. I'm talking about time. Some days, my dot is over here. Other days, my dot is over here. My dot moves. It doesn't stay in the same place. Y'all with static genders have a dot that would fluctuate within a very small range over time. But my awesome dynamic gender fluctuates over a large range. Therefore, gender fluid. And it fluctuates outside the binary, so gender fluid of the non-binary variety. And finally, I'm trans because I'm definitely not cis, and I'm someone who embraces that label. Cool. Moving on, let's talk about how prevalent the double rainbows are. If you attended Neurodivergent and Gender Divergent by Sean McGill on Thursday, you already know the numbers. At the risk of being redundant and boring, let's look at some cute graphics I made. According to the Boffins, the rate of autism in transgender people is higher than those of cisgender people. I'm simplifying this, but if you have 4 transgender people in a room, one of them is statistically autistic. In order to statistically find one autistic in a group of cisgender people, you'd need to have about 20 of them. And this goes uphill both ways. The rate in which autistic people are transgender is also 5 times higher than those of allistic people, meaning a group of 10 autistics, one of them is statistically transgender. Whereas you need to get a group of 50 allistics to statistically find that one trans person. So here's me in the middle. Hi. Ooh, wrong button. Didn't mean to scroll there. I meant to scroll here. Hi. We're like little unicorns because a lot of people in power don't think we exist. Additionally, lots of people don't want us to exist, and historically, a lot of efforts have been made and continue to be made to stop us from existing. When the world you live in was created to exclude you, you grew up feeling excluded. Shocking, I know. So here's where my trigger warning applies. In America, the average human lifespan is mid-70s. So the average American living an average life can expect to live well into retirement, thanks modern medicine. Autistic people, by comparison, have a lifespan that is half that. We tend to die in our 30s. We don't have enough data to really tell us what the mortality rate is for transgender people, but we do know that it's also higher than the average population. The top reasons for our deaths, and I mean today, not in the 1930s and 40s when we wore pink or black armbands. The number one reason for an autistic person's death is drowning. We are known to wander and elope from our parents as kids, and sometimes that tragically ends in a drowning accident. The second leading cause is injury, including suffocation and asphyxiation. We are naturally curious and sometimes lack the much-needed life preservation skills, which can result in tragically ending our own lives if left unsupervised. The third leading cause are several co-occurring medical conditions, including epilepsy, heart problems, and cancer. It's not yet been studied in depth whether or not autistic people are more susceptible to medical problems such as these, but what I do know is that we are often talked over in the exam room. Sometimes it's your parent or guardian making assumptions and talking on your behalf, which leads the doctor down the wrong paths. And sometimes it's the doctor who's stretched for time and can't spend the appropriate amount of time communicating with you. So yeah, I can imagine a cancer diagnosis being caught late because we couldn't figure out how to explain the early signs, or because we were already sick with other chronic illnesses, we just lumped these new symptoms into that. The last leading cause I'm going to mention is suicide. Not only do we think about killing ourselves more often than others, we succeed at it. And yes, I recognize that more studies need to be done, more data needs to be collected, but I can tell you anecdotally that I've thought about killing myself because I'm not ignorant to the fact that this world never wanted me in it. It's taken me a lot of therapy to realize that I'm not the problem, despite the whole world telling me it is. When I was very little, I talked to myself. I think in visuals. In order for me to process what I see in my mind into language that I could speak and express and share with others, I talked my thoughts out. It was a kind of translation process. But very early on, people told me that was weird and I shouldn't do it. So I pretended not to. Of course, instead I'd keep my mouth closed, but my tongue would still move as if I was speaking. I wasn't as effective because I needed to hear the words to process them from another sensory organ, but it was the best I could come up with using my little kid brain. And the thing is, this is a core memory. Yes, the teasing and the correcting was ongoing, but I have a very vivid memory of when I was 7 years old and walking home from school. I happened to be passing by the library. I remember it was a sunny day, but still chilly, so I was wearing a jacket. I could feel the wind of the cars rushing past my left. And it was then I thought the worst thought of my young life, and it stuck with me ever since. I am broken. I believed I was a broken human as young as 7 because I was convinced that other people could think without talking, and I was the only person in the world who couldn't. Everyone else thought in words, and words were readily available to express their thoughts. But not for the broken human that was me. I didn't think in words, and words didn't come to me easily. Before that moment of realization, any discrimination I faced as an undiagnosed autistic child with no firm gender identity other than tomboy and no sexual orientation because I hadn't developed yet, it all went over my head. My family certainly felt it because they didn't have resources to support me early on. After my existential breakthrough of recognizing that I'm a defective human, every sexist, ableist, and homophobic interaction just further validated that I shouldn't exist. One of my homework assignments from my therapist is that I need to actively seek out validation for why I should exist, because I focus on why I shouldn't for too long. And my therapy cat has joined the chat. I did a very unofficial study last year. It was a simple survey of when people believed they were autistic to when they were diagnosed, or otherwise accepted the label in the case of self-diagnosis. The survey results showed a bimodal distribution. The first peak confirmed that parents recognize their children having challenges at the age of 2 and 3, and then get diagnosed at around 4 years old. The second peak revealed that those of us who discover being autistic later in life usually starts in our 20s, with most of us getting confirmation around the age of 27. I titled this survey When the Mask Falls because it is my hypothesis that autistic people, diagnosed or not, are tired of masking and pretending to be normal in a world that doesn't want us by the time we reach 30. Assuming we survive our childhood, which includes filicide, the incidents where parents or caregivers murder their disabled children due to the overwhelming stress they suffer to care for them, and the media that takes their side justifying the murder, we very well might be done with the stress of adulthood after being adult for about the same length of time as we tried being a child. So a lifespan into the mid-30s, that's GANs. So I talked a lot about death. Now I want to talk about birth and early life. I have a child that makes me a parent, and because I'm trans, I wanted to know when and how children develop their own gender identity in the hopes that I could do it right with my child, especially considering it took me nearly 30 years to figure out my own. In my rabbit hole, I read that children start recognizing the binary gender expression before they reach even 2 years old. And I say expression because I specifically mean they recognize physical traits, like how they'll associate breasts with women and beards with men. By the time they're 3, the neurotypical child may have a consistent gender identity label within the binary construct. And then by age 4, they have a stable sense of which one of the two they are. By the time they're 6, most children will gravitate towards other kids that they associate to be of the same gender as themselves during playtime. Basically, kids are figuring out if they are a boy or a girl by the age of 3 and should have an answer for you by their 4th birthday. Since my kid could talk and discuss the features on people, I've been consistent at explaining what these features are not gendered. Not all men have beards. Not all people with beards are men. Not all women have breasts, and not all people with breasts are women. Since we use the anatomically correct words for genitals, those too weren't gendered. When my kids started talking about people in the terms of boys and girls, I introduced the concept of non-binary people, but in a developmentally appropriate way. I'd say there are boys, girls, both, and none. We even have this little back and forth that I initiate by asking, "What is Daddy's gender identity?" And she'll answer by saying boy. I ask her, "What is her gender identity?" And I never told her what she was. She just always said girl. I end it with asking, "Well, what's my gender identity?" And she says, "Both a boy and a girl." Occasionally, we'll talk about our friends and family members. I'll ask her what she thinks their gender identity is, and she'll respond. She proved these findings correct. She consistently identifies as a girl and will be turning 5 next month. It was after she turned 4 did we start discussing replacing the phrase boy and girl with the term non-binary for myself, which she lovingly pronounces as nonbinary. So whomever said trans parents turn their children trans, I'm sorry to break it to you, but we don't. My child grew up knowing the gender identity options that I know now, has daily representation and exposure of these options, and still proudly exclaims that she's a girl. My daughter sports a pixie cut so short that people of all ages misgender her for a boy, to which she aggressively corrects them. My child may express herself in a masculine way, but she is still a girl. And she doesn't do it because she secretly wants to be a boy. She told me she just hates having hair in her face, especially when we're riding in the car with the windows down. Her short hair is an accommodation to her sensory sensitivities, which stems from being autistic. Just last weekend, we saw a woman with her hair cut at swim class. I pointed her out to my kid to let her know there's another girl with her hairstyle, and the way she smiled was infectious. I later tapped that woman on the shoulder and complimented her hair, and thanked her for being representation for my kid. And she was so excited and mentioned that she noticed us earlier too. The correlation I couldn't help but notice is that autism and gender identity are both things that seem to manifest around the same age. Our children, by the age of 3 and 4, are capable of recognizing and identifying with a gender ideology. Up until then, they've been learning to communicate, and it's been long enough that an observer like their parent or caregiver might recognize if they aren't hitting their milestones. In my survey, most parents and guardians suspected autism at the age of 2. There's already a lot of data that shows the most common age that someone is diagnosed as autistic is at 4 years old, and my survey supports that as well. I considered that my child could be autistic when she was only 6 months old, but nobody took me seriously because it's not something that gets diagnosed until the age of 3 or 4, which, quick tangent from my tangent, but isn't it interesting that gender identity and autistic identity both have milestones that start at that age? My pattern recognizing brain thought that was super cool observation, and I'd love to see more data on that. But back to my first tangent. Nobody understood how I could see or understand my child in such a deep way, and it's not like I could have proved it. The problem with diagnosis is that it's all based on someone's ability to observe the autistic behavior and then make guesses as to what's going on inside. If you're autistic, that's hard because you can't really relate to the behaviors the way other autistics do. Not only that, but by the time the kid comes in for an evaluation, something has already been labeled as problematic, inappropriate, or delayed when compared to peers of the same age. The diagnosis doesn't look at how these beautiful little children process the world and then picks up that they process it differently. I couldn't even get a doctor to take me seriously until I said the magic words. Her behavior was negatively affecting me. If anything, it just highlights how reactive this process is as opposed to being proactive. The system requires its people to fail before it will help, and I've seen this pattern across many systems. I couldn't get unemployment financial assistance when I lost my job because I only worked there for 9 months instead of 1 year. I guess those 3 months are super important in whether or not I'm worthy. Support is only provided in school if the need has been proved by a paper trail of failed tests, because they don't have the funding to hire or retain PCAs to help kids who are on the edge of failure or at the risk of failure. When I was pregnant, I had to use all of my PTO before FMLA could be used, which means I had to save it all up. The enrollment period for my medical insurance is in February, and people thought I was joking when I said I aimed to have a November baby so that my entire pregnancy was in a single year, because deductibles and copays add up, and I knew I was going to hit my out-of-pocket maximum. We had to have a global emergency before people even looked at helping student loan borrowers. I was one of them. I'm so privileged to have been able to pay off my student loans during the pandemic. This is a great segue into politics. And I know I'm not supposed to announce a segue, but I'm autistic and I love how the word sounds, how it feels in my mouth when I say it, and how it's spelled like it's not supposed to, since we're taught to learn how to say things by sounding them out. So I'm going to say it 3 more times before I move on. Segue. 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 In the political landscape, laws that create barriers and outright ban gender-affirming care have been proposed. Oops, I forgot to progress my slide. Too excited about this. Some have passed, some don't, but it's more like a game of numbers, I think. To me, these lawmakers' plan is obvious. They start with most vulnerable person, or vulnerable population, the one with the least civil rights, the one that doesn't have a voice, because they can't legally vote until they're 18. The next group is one that doesn't often get a voice because accessibility, if you haven't noticed, isn't really a high priority in government. And now they're trying to take it away. Legislators believe autistic people can't possibly fathom gender identity. They argue that people who suffer from depression, anxiety, or suicidality aren't capable of making decisions and consenting to gender-affirming care. I've yet to meet an autistic or trans person who doesn't have depression, anxiety, or CPTSD. Worse yet, many of the men that were arrested for storming the Capitol have been using autism in their trials in attempts to infantilize themselves and avoid accountability. Of the children diagnosed with ASD, up to 30% of them are non-speaking, which means about 70% or more can speak like me, probably better. Of the children diagnosed with ASD, about 38% have a co-occurring intellectual disability, and that makes about 62% that don't. Speaking is not the same as thinking, and an intellectual disability doesn't mean they can't learn. Being autistic is not a reason to doubt our gender identity or avoid accountability. If this continues, you force people into making a choice. Their options include getting support for their needs as it relates to autism while pretending they're cisgender, since nobody will believe them as trans, getting gender-affirming care while pretending they're autistic, because telling the truth might get their care taken away, or kill themselves because living a lie is not worth living at all. Have I hammered in how important it is to support autistic trans people? I'm sure my casual references to suicide is unnerving, but I'm hoping to put this into perspective about how important our work is to create a welcoming place for people like me. You might not know me personally, but if you're here, then that tells me you care about someone like me, or you are like me and you're struggling to care about yourself. If you were to ask me who the next group is that these laws will target, I would tell you it's another group whose civil rights come and go: the incarcerated. When I was 6 years old, I had a parent go to prison, and I was left in the custody of my grandparents. That parent, because it was a federal offense in the 90s, couldn't vote for 9 years after release. That's not restorative justice. There was no plan in place to reintroduce them to civil rights. They didn't get confetti thrown them on the first day of their 6th year after prison saying, "Congratulations, you can vote now." No, it was just another day in an established routine of not caring about their right to vote. The laws around this vary from state to state, and in 2020, Pennsylvania, the state that I'm in, passed a law removing that 5-year wait, so the right to vote is reinstated upon release. But there's several surveys that indicate that people still don't know that and assume they can't vote. So if you're one of those people who registers others to vote, try that demographic because many don't even know they can. At any rate, that's just my best guess based on my own autistic pattern recognition skills and imagining what I'd do if I were them. But back to the main topic, I appreciate y'all are still with me in this roller coaster of a talk. It's a small preview to how I process things that are loosely associated with one another that leads me down the next rabbit hole. Somehow this leads me to my next segue into a thinking pattern I've been trying to put words into. I'm not going to go over the diagnostic criteria for autism. Instead, I'm just going to give you my impression of it from an autistic point of view. As it's currently written in the DSM and ICD, how it's always been written, the criteria is all based on observable behaviors. And I get it, my demographic hasn't always been the best at communicating things, and many of the patients are usually pre-verbal or non-speaking children, so diagnosis lies with the medical professional's ability to read our body language. But the one criterion I want to pick at is the first one, the one that requires us to have persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. When I was in second grade, I was labeled a problem child by the school for talking back to a teacher. In my defense, we were doing a vocabulary activity where the teacher would say a word and then choose a student to use that word in a sentence. I had a sentence for every word. My hand would shoot up every time, and she never chose me. Understandably, the teacher can't choose me every time because she had a whole class to engage, but I was an autistic 7-year-old. I was told the rule is when you have an answer, you raise your hand, and it was never explicitly explained to me that I wouldn't be called on every single time. So that was my black and white thinking at play. Additionally, I was not given the tools on how to emotionally handle the disappointment that came along with being skipped over repeatedly. And I mean repeatedly from my point of view, because I did the hand raising a lot, and each one that went ignored was another data point. So anyway, because I grew up in rural Pennsylvania town that loved to hunt deer, the conversation quickly grew off topic when the word to be used was edge. And a child responded by saying, I saw a deer on the edge of a mountain. That's not even a good use for the word edge. Mountains don't have edges. But whatever, that's me being autistically literal again. The conversation veered away from our vocabulary lesson into where everywhere these kids saw deer. And if I hadn't made it clear, deer are everywhere. So perhaps the key to this teacher's selection process was to look as sad and disinterested as possible. And I'm sure there's a valid unwritten rule for people who lead discussions where that makes a logical sense to someone who naturally understands social situations. But I was acknowledged by this teacher for the first time in this lesson, to which I said, I thought we were talking about edges. Now, I thought I was being helpful by reminding people what we were supposed to be doing. But I was also annoyed that I was being largely ignored, and I felt like my time was being wasted because we were talking about something I had zero interest in. Medical professionals who know anything about autism will know that it's challenging to engage us in non-preferred activities. And again, I was 7 years old and not very good at masking, so my tone came up as rude. It was declared that I was talking back to the teacher, and I was promptly sent to the principal's office that and that problem child label followed me for the rest of the school year. I would have preferred having an autism label instead, but I digress. My point is that I've always had deficits in social interaction. I'd argue that I have a unique communication style that others don't understand easily, but well, magic is just science that's not understood, right? Another one of these magical deficits is my understanding of authoritative relationships, as in, I'm finally recognizing that I don't have one. Apparently, you're supposed to treat people in positions of authority way differently than those not in positions of authority. And this might be autistic of me to simplify this concept to respect. I'm told certain people deserve more respect than others because of their chosen profession or age. So my brain processes as a authority figures equals high levels of respect versus non-authority figures with normal levels of respect. it didn't occur to me that people just don't get respect. Everyone has a base level in my brain. But the problem is, I don't know what an authority figure really is. Because when I was little, I was always in trouble. I was constantly being corrected for things I did wrong. And my response was to dig my heels in, learn as much as I could, and be that know-it-all kid because I was constantly feeling disrespected and I was seeking a basic level of respect. Growing up like this, I felt like I was inferior to everyone. I assumed everyone was an authority figure because everyone got that level of respect that I didn't. In every room that I was in, I assumed I was the stupidest, dumbest. I work in marketing, and popular joke is that when everything's a priority, nothing actually is. Mm. So here I am, adorable little Tessa, growing up and treating everyone the same. As you can imagine, people who are in actual authoritative positions don't like being treated the same. They want to be treated with extra respect. And again, this isn't something I recognized I did until later in life. This is something that got me in trouble so many times because these are the people who thought me rude when in reality, I was giving them the same level of respect as I gave my friends, my parents. My dog got extra respect though. I wanted to establish this because many of my struggles and the struggles of autistic and neurodivergent people are with invisible and seemingly arbitrary social constructs, especially as they vary across cultures and religions. In some parts of the world, eye contact is seen as a challenge and should be avoided unless you want to convey aggression. In other parts of the world, eye contact is seen as a sign of respect and should be given to show you that your attention is on them. Show them that your attention's on them. Another such social construct is gender. At some point in our history, we assign roles and responsibilities to people based on the genitals they were born with. And if they were ambiguous, they'd have an unnecessary surgery performed on the infant to force their bodies into this binary social construct. So if gender is a social construct, and I struggle to identify and comply with social constructs, then the logical conclusion is that it makes sense that autistic people and transgender people would have the overlap that it has. My pansexuality, that I could fall in love with anyone of any gender because the social construct around gender is meaningless to me, makes sense. My gender fluidity, that I feel like I can take on any of these gender stereotyped roles and responsibilities, and I'm not compelled to restrain myself to just one because the social constructs in which they were assigned are meaningless to me, makes sense. The last big connection I want to showcase before we get to Q&A is the intertwined medical history. Let's start at the very beginning. The word homosexual was coined about 140 years ago by German-speaking Hungarian writer Karl Maria Kurt Benny. Autism wasn't studied yet. It had no language until 25-ish years later when Eugene Bleuler coined the word autism. But during those 25-ish years, we had a German psychiatrist named Albert von Schrecknotzking claim he turned a gay man straight, and good old Sigmund Freud believed homosexuality was a stunt in growth. So straight away, gay is bad. Language was only developed for our community because they needed to talk about what they wanted to get rid of. We're going to jump to 1938 to when my grandpa was born. When he was 5 years old, and this was 80 years ago, Kanner syndrome was named. A year later, Hans Asperger starts experiments with his group of autistic kids. These are the kids that wore black armbands, by the way. It was in the first 20 years of my grandpa's life that people blamed inadequate early parenting for homosexuality and autism. Around 73 years ago, grandpa was in his preteens. The first aversion therapy for queer men was developed in Czechoslovakia. It was around 71 years ago, when grandpa was only 14 years old, that the first DSM was published. Queer and gender diverse people were categorized under sociopathic personality disturbance. Meanwhile, the word autism was only used to describe a presentation of pediatric schizophrenia. The parallels in history are fascinating to me. About 10 years later, Czechoslovakia concluded that the aversion therapy they developed was ineffective and ultimately decided to decriminalize homosexuality. The UK, however, very much kept it criminalized, decided that this treatment was awesome, and offered it as an alternative to prisoners. 58 years ago, Grandpa was 27, Ol Ivar Lovas invented applied behavior analysis, shortened to ABA, to treat autism. The technique he introduced was designed to force children into, looked there, then looked here. Forced into, this is why I'm distracting myself. The technique he introduced was designed to force autistic children into appearing indistinguishable from their peers. He combined positive reinforcement for desirable behaviors with aversive techniques for undesirable behaviors. This often looked like love bombing from parents and electric shocks when kids wouldn't comply. 2 years later, my mom was born. I had those little pictures swapped around. And a year after that, DSM-2 was published. Being queer was moved to being under personality disorders, and autism officially made its debut as its own real form of childhood schizophrenia, marked by detachment from reality. My mother was only 2 years old when the Stonewall riot occurred. She wouldn't have remembered it, but Grandpa might. When she was 13 years old, the DSM-3 was published. Being gay got a whole makeover. It was named ego-dystonic homosexuality and was recategorized as a psychosexual disorder. This is when gender identity disorder joined the club and autism finally got divorced from schizophrenia. It was added as a pervasive developmental disorder and called infantile autism. A year later, Lorna Wing looks over Hans Asperger did in the concentration camps and defined his subjects as having Asperger's syndrome. 36 years ago, my older sister was born, and the DSM-3R was published that recategorized homosexuality as a sexual disorder, and infantile autism was renamed to autistic disorder. That's my sister. Yeah, DSM-3. 4 years later, I'm born. It's me. In my first year of life, Uda Frith translated Asperger's work into English, popularizing it. I was 3 years old when the DSM-4 was published that added Asperger's syndrome. I was 7 years old, that same 7-year-old that was a problem child in school, when all of that hullabaloo about the MMR vaccine causing autism was a thing. 2 years after 9/11, I was in the 7th grade, and the DSM-5 was published. It no longer had homosexuality listed at all. Gender identity disorder was renamed to gender dysphoria. Autistic disorder was renamed to autism spectrum disorder, and Asperger's syndrome was removed. I have like a whole spiel, but I'll just let that screen be in there. The pattern here is that humanity saw homosexuality, gender diversity, and neurodiversity as something to eradicate. If they couldn't cure individuals, then they'd cure society by removing these individuals. The difference is the Stonewall riot. They stood up and started to fight. After that, we saw the pathology change from changing people to focusing on their internal discomfort. Unfortunately, autism has not had such a catalytic event. Shock treatment is still used on autistic and disabled people. ABA is still touted as the golden standard and promoted to parents despite it still largely triggering fear and anxiety in children with their sticker charts and attention extinction methods. There are many organizations focusing on the genome trying to identify the cause of autism, including Google that partnered up with Autism Speaks for their missing project. If they found it, do you think they'll just leave it alone? We already know from the research done with Down syndrome that screenings performed on babies in the womb lead to more parents aborting those healthy babies. These findings just further validate that the world does not want us. It never did. I also don't want to be misconstrued. I'm not at all saying our work is done just because homosexuality is no longer in the DSM. In all honesty, I would also like to see autism removed from the DSM and ICD altogether too. Autism doesn't kill people. Autism by itself doesn't require treatment. It's not a disease, and it's not a mental disorder. Autism is a perfectly valid variation of being human and has no business having accommodations gatekept by the medical industry. Sorry, just moving things out of the way. When my husband and I were seeking early intervention for our daughter, a diagnosis was not required. They evaluated her needs and skills, identified areas that needed support, and then matched her up with appropriate services. That's what I think the medical industry should be doing. That's why I believe autistic self-diagnosis is valid. And this was just a brief medical history. Erin Reed did a lovely job describing the political history on Thursday in her closing keynote speech. Our history is an ancient history. My grandfather, the one born decades before the DSM was ever published, is still alive. Look around for our elder queers. Jasmine Butterfly is such a person who will be giving their keynote speech today at 12:45, and I implore you to go listen to her story and ask her questions. People like her and my grandpa lived through a lot of it. And with that, this concludes my info dump. I'm ready to enter the Q&A session. All of my presentations, resources, references, and media credits are listed on my website here. I'm a huge fan of fact checking. And let's go. Let's ask questions so it's not awkward.